Okay, next we're going to have Stu Nishenko, who is with the senior seismologist in the Geosciences Department of Pacific Gas and Electric. He serves as the technical manager of the Central Coast California Seismic Imaging Project.
Commissioners Weisenmiller, Alistair Florio, good morning, and thank you for allowing PGD the opportunity to report out on the progress that we have made addressing the recommendations in the Energy Commission's AB 1632 report. This morning, I have three basic questions that I want to address in my presentation, and there's quite a lot of material here. I'll try to get through it in a timely fashion, but if we kind of reach the limit, please let me know, and we'll terminate this as quickly as possible. So the first question here is seismic hazards, Diablo Canyon, the overall status of ongoing efforts to understand those hazards through a long-term seismic program. And we are currently following a Senior Seismic Hazard Analysis Committee, or SHAC, Level 3 process that is scheduled to be completed in 2015. I'll get the hang of this.
Yeah, the roller wheel work.
I can run it for you if you prefer.
My apologies.
No, no worries.
Okay,
Unfamiliar
so next
technology.
slide. Actually, let's go back one. Okay, so this is a flow chart that shows the seismic hazard analysis of SHAC process update. And the point that we want to make is the role of the information that we're collecting as part of the AB 1632 process is kind of in the box over here on the left-hand side of the slide. So this is information that we basically describe as seismic source characterization, finding basic information about the earthquake sources, their geometry, the rate of activity, things like that, that then get fed into this hazard update process that finally at the end winds up with a probabilistic seismic hazard update. So the work that we're doing as part of AB 1632 is integral to that seismic hazard update. Next slide. The information that we're considering as part of this process includes the original 1988 LTSP tectonic model, and then new data that we've collected as part of the AB 1632 studies, including marine data, multi-beam echo sounding of the seafloor, low energy seismic deflection surveys of the sea, as well as onshore data where we're again doing 2D and 3D seismic reflection surveys on land, geologic mapping, topographic mapping, as well as potential field mapping, looking at variations of gravity and magnetics. So to address the specific request that we use three-dimensional data, this is an example of the kind of information that we are considering, and I'll have some examples of that later on this morning. Next slide. In terms of ground motion characterization, it's sort of the complementary half to a seismic source characterization. We've been very busy in continuing to develop our next generation ground motion model in terms of adding more information to the database, as well as making updates to the model itself. In addition to, if you will, empirical updates, we've also been working very closely with scientists from USGS, Southern California Earthquake Center, and the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center in Berkeley to develop numerical models, dynamic rupture models, finite fault simulations, to help fill in the blanks, if you will, what we don't know from observed information from earthquakes. This turns out to be critical to help us understand the question about the intersection of the shoreline and the Osprey Fault, for instance. We'll talk about that next slide. So question number 2 says, at this point in time, have we found any information to indicate larger than expected hazards at Diablo Canyon, and whether or not the plant was built with sufficient margin to continue operating reliably and safely? At this point, we have not found any evidence to to suggest that we have a problem with the plant, but I just caution you that the report, the Shack Level 3 report, which will address all this in great detail, is scheduled to be completed in March of 2015. But right now, there's nothing on the horizon. Next slide. And so here we were asked to delve into a little more detail about our progress in completing the AB 1632 recommended study. So that's what I'm going to be addressing for the rest of the presentation. Next slide. And just as a reminder, the 1632 study, which was an assessment of California's nuclear power plants, recommended that both PG&E and Edison update their seismic hazard assessments, and this is the SHAC process that we actually initiated prior to the NRC issuing their 5054F requirements after Fukushima in 2011, and also to use 3D geophysical reflection mapping and other advanced techniques to supplement these previous and ongoing programs. So as I showed you before, and we'll show again how we're using that information moving forward. Next slide. This is just quickly a summary of the funding history for the project. We began with an initial request of $16.7 million in 2010. About a year later, in September 2011, reopened that request for additional funds, and now we have a budget of about $64.25 million to cover all the research activities that we had identified. Next slide. Again, as part of the decision to provide that funding, the Public Utilities Commission required that an independent peer review panel be established, and that is comprised of representatives from the California agencies that you see listed here, as well as a member of supervisor from San Luis Obispo County to provide some oversight. Next slide. This is a slide of the seismicity offshore Diablo Canyon. So Diablo Canyon itself is located right about here. This area is called the Irish Hills, and what you see offshore of the plant is the seismicity patterns that we are concerning ourselves with. This is information, by the way, that was provided from Gene Hardebeck of the U.S. Geological Survey, and there are two sets of dots, red dots and green dots. I think the red dots are updates of earlier locations that were done in 2010, and using new, improved information, the red dots give us relocations as of 2012. The point that I wanted to make here is that with the seismicity, you can clearly see the strands, the two strands of the Hosbury Fault that exist offshore. Here's a western strand, and there's another eastern strand that exists right here at the edge of the continental shelf. But more importantly is this lineation of seismicity that runs close to the shoreline near Diablo Canyon. So this is the seismicity that initially was used to confirm the fact that there is a shoreline fault zone offshore the power plant. And that started a whole series of investigations that we'll report on.
Could you point out exactly in this map where Diablo Canyon is? Is it sort of on that open spot?
So
halfway
it's
up?
right about here.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. Thank you.
Right. So the proximity of this lineation of seismicity to the plant itself is less than a kilometer, probably under about 600, 700 meters. Next slide. We used what we call a seismic source characterization sensitivity study to help us prioritize the kind of information that we needed to improve our seismic hazard study for the area. So basically what we're trying to do here is reduce the uncertainty in some of the basic parameters that we need to know in order to do the seismic hazard assessment. And this sensitivity here shows different realizations of the hazard depending on variations in particular parameters, like variations in the slip rate of the Hosbury Fault or the dip of the Hosbury Fault produce a wide variation in what the answer is that we're going to get. So that's a measure of the uncertainty. So we've designed the work that we've done to try to reduce that uncertainty and get better estimates of the slip rate of the Hosbury, for instance, or the slip rate of the shoreline fault, as well as looking at the dips or the geometry of these major fault zones that we have identified in and around the Diablo Canyon area to improve the accuracy of the hazard assessment. Next slide. Okay, this is supposed to be kind of a sequential slide, but the point that I want to make here is from 2009 to 2011, we've been doing a great deal of work onshore and offshore. It began with seafloor mapping and this potential field mapping, looking at the gravity and magnetic field in and around the coastline here to basically confirm what we saw with the seismicity lineation. One of the, and again, to address the requirement that we use 3D seismic studies of the area, we started a program of low-energy 3D seismic investigations at the northern section where the shoreline intersects the Osprey, and it also started investigations at the southern end where the shoreline fault goes into San Luis Bay. So this is to better understand the geometry of that intersection between these two major fault zones, as well as what's the overall length of the shoreline fault zone. Just to step back a minute, this is the trace of the Osprey fault zone that runs along the edge of the continental shelf, and this is the fault zone that's considered to be the principal seismic source for our calculations. In addition to working offshore, we also decided to initiate a fairly comprehensive program onshore, looking at, again, the geology of faulting onshore, the Los Osos Fault, which runs along the eastern side of the Irish Hills, as well as other faults within the core of the hills themselves. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. Next slide. In 2012, we continued these investigations, and here's where we looked again in more detail in San Luis Bay at the shoreline fault zone. In 2011, we discovered information that was going to, we think, help us constrain the rate of motion on the shoreline fault zone. So we went back in 12 and collected more data to help us with that analysis. And then also extended that analysis to the Osprey Fault further offshore, looking for information that would give us an independent confirmation about what the rate of fault motion is on the Osprey. Currently, the only primary source of information we have on the rate of motion of the Osprey is where it comes on shore in San Simeon. So there's a great stretch of this fault where it's underwater and heretofore unavailable for geologic investigation. So we're trying to address that right now. In 11, we spent a lot of time onshore in the central and eastern part of the Irish Hills. In 12, we spent a great deal of time in the area in and around Diablo Canyon itself, doing onshore seismic reflection profiling and getting a better idea of the geology in that area. Next slide. This is a comparison, this bathymetric mapping of the kind of information that we had in 1988 when the original LTSP model was proposed, and the information that we've got now in 2009 when we started doing multi-beam mapping in cooperation with the seafloor mapping lab at the University of California, Monterey Bay. And you can clearly see between these two images just how far the technology has improved in the last 20 years, both in the quality of the imaging, and probably the biggest improvement is the advent of global positioning systems, GPS. So all this is basically added to what I call this revolution in resolution. We can start seeing things now in a lot clearer detail than we could 20, 30 years ago. So the shoreline, well, and this liniment you see right here off of the plant, this footprint is located here. This liniment is what we're calling the shoreline fault zone. So you can see how clearly that shows up in the submarine bathymetry compared to what we had 20, 30 years ago. So it's probably no wonder that that wasn't fully recognized or appreciated at the time. Next slide. But one of the operational issues that we had, actually, if you can go back a slide, is the existence of what we call the white zone. You really can't see it here, but there's an area near shore that's impossible to get into with conventional boats that we're using to do this multi-beam mapping because of the presence of kelp in the water, shallow rocks, and things like that. It kind of limited how far close to shore we could get. So working with the folks in Monterey Bay, next slide, they developed basically put a sonar head on a jet ski. And we're able to take the jet ski in and out of the shallow water and allow us to fill in this white zone. So now we have comprehensive bathymetric cover from the shore out to sea, or basically wall-to-wall coverage of the sea floor. So this is key in that it allows us to basically continue geologic structures that we map onshore to the offshore and vice versa. Next slide. In addition to that seafloor mapping, we also did what we call potential field mapping. We're looking at subtle variations in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field as well as the Earth's gravity field to better understand geologic structures in the area. So this is a summary of the helicopter survey we did in 2010 across the shoreline fault zone. Again, Diablo Canyon is located right here. One of the characteristics early on that was recognized was that fault zone itself seemed to be associated with a series of magnetic highs, probably because of rocks that were entrained inside the fault zone itself. And that gave us a good marker to actually not only trace the continuity of that fault zone, but also model its geometry and its potential depth. The next slide shows the results from a gravity survey, which was done earlier by the USGS, and we're actually in the process of updating as we speak to get more gravity data. But here, the key point is that there are more information available for us to use to address these problems, to constrain these geometries than just seismic. And this becomes critical down the road because of the fact that our application for doing high energy seismic in the offshore was denied last year. So we are looking at other data like gravity, magnetics, and old seismic data that was collected in the 70s and 80s to see if we can address these questions without having to go through that and reapply for doing high energy work. Next slide. This is a helicopter shot of the vessel that we're using to do some of the low energy work in San Luis Bay, and this is again state-of-the-art technology. This is called a P-cable. Back here where you're dragging about 14 separate streamers that are about 50 meters length. Behind the boat, the sound source is located here. And what this allows us to do is do these surveys, or what we call mow the lawn, in a quicker amount of time, a shorter amount of time. When we first started doing this in 2010, we only had 4 streamers behind the boat. So tripling the number of streamers basically makes it more effective and less time to do. Next slide. All the data that we've collected for the marine work has been processed in Houston, and this is just a flow chart showing how that data was processed, and also that each step of that processing was had a quality control process as well. All the work that we're doing under AB 1632 is being done to nuclear quality assurance standards. There's a whole set of procedures that need to be followed and records to be kept for all this information as collected and processed and interpreted. It's all being done to the highest standards possible. Next slide. So the first work that we did in 2010 and 2011 was off of Point Bashan. Here in the inset map, again, Diablo Canyon is here. So this is the area where the shoreline fault was seismicity, okay, that was associated with the shoreline fault, was seen to start to intersect the Hosgri. So we went and first to that area to see what we could learn about the geology and geometry. This is what we call a time section from the 3D survey that we did. So this is basically a horizontal slice through the volume that we collected at a depth of about 115 meters below sea level, or roughly about 50-60 meters below the sea floor. Prior to our doing this work in 2010 and 11, previous surveys in the area had looked with the spacing between ship tracks on the order of 800 meters. For the 3D survey that we did here, spacing between ship tracks is on the order of 12 to 20 meters. So a dramatic increase in the density of data, the resolution, that then allows you to put together literally a 3D volume that you can look at different orientations, take slices as you see here in different directions to help you further understand the geologic structure. So in our 2011 report to the NRC on the shoreline fault zone, we had identified a number of faults in the area in addition to the Hosgary featured in 2011 that we called the North 40 West Fault, that using the new data that we collected in 10 and 11, we've now renamed as the Point Bouchon Fault, and also come to realize and map greater detail for this fault zone than we knew before. Next slide shows an overlay then of the seismicity, again these red and green dots that I showed you in an earlier slide, on this time slice. And again, to try to understand the correlation between geologic structure and seismicity in this area. One of the things that is difficult is that this low energy seismic survey, or less, only gives you imaging to the top 200 or 300 meters of the seafloor. This doesn't have enough energy to propagate deeper. And the seismicity that we're looking at here is occurring at depths of 3, 4, 10 kilometers below. So necessarily what you see at the surface may not reflect everything that's going on at depth. But again, it is a step forward. Our original goal was to try to do basically top to bottom mapping from the seafloor down to the depths of the earthquake so we can understand that entire crustal column. Next slide. This is kind of a complicated diagram, but the point being is as you get into that intersection zone between the shoreline and the Hosgary Fault, the seismicity starts to merge together, and a lot of times it's not clear whether you're looking at earthquakes that are happening on the Hosgary Fault, you're looking at earthquakes that are happening on the shoreline, and what the relationship between the two of them are. I think later on this morning, Dr. Hardebeck is going to talk about this a little bit later, but this is a point where a lot of the numerical modeling that we've been doing with the other groups comes into value, in that it helps us to start understanding what the mechanical interactions are between these two faults, and hence what kind of earthquakes we could expect if these faults interacted with one another. So this gets to understanding the reality of the situation and how it impacts ground motions at the plant itself. Next slide. The report for that 2010-11 survey was completed in 2012 and was transmitted to both the IPRP as well as the SHAC study team to inform them in their deliberations. And as our policy is also being posted on the PG&E website. So we have a policy to provide all the information to the public as part of the transparency. We'll talk about that in the last slide. This is just one of the reports that we're coming out with in data sets. This is our boat again, and here we're going to be talking about the southern end of the shoreline fault zone in San Luis Bay. Next slide. When we were doing reconnaissance work in San Luis Bay in the winter rather, of 2011, we uncovered what at the time looked like the ancestral continuation of San Luis Obispo Creek, which is located here on shore, as it cut across the continental shelf out into the Santa Maria Basin. So this is a contour map of that buried channel, if you will, stream channel, as it was cutting across the continental shelf. What got us excited about this is that the trace of the shoreline fault zone, shown here in red, cuts across that channel. So this is an example of what geologists call a piercing point, where you have a geomorphic feature that's cut by a fault, and then if you can document offsets of that geomorphic feature, and you know something about the age, you can come up with a rate of motion. So we went back in 2012 and 2011 to survey this area in much more detail. The inset shows the survey tracks that were done in 11 and 12 using this 3D technology. And this is really where it kind of shines. Next slide. This is just one profile through that buried channel. You can kind of see how the surface here, the basement surface, has been eroded away and then filled in with sediment. So this is an uninterpreted profile. On the next slide shows you an interpreted profile where we have bedrock surface below, the channel that was cut in during the low sea level stand, then later filled in, and then overlying younger sediments, seafloor surfaces located right here. So in 3D, what we can do is put many of these profiles together, stack them up next to one another, and come up with this volume. And the next slide, to kind of show you, hopefully this is going to work, what we can do with the volume. So here is from top to bottom, ocean surface, down through the seafloor. Next slide. Rats. Okay, that was another sequential slide, but the whole idea is that basically you can peel away the layers and look at the geologic structure in details. So if this had worked, what you would have seen, we peel away the ocean layer, you can see the seafloor, then we identify where that basement surface is, where the hard rock is, peel away the overlying younger sediments, and the next slide then shows the geometry of this channel, the buried paleo channels, as they cut across the continental shelf. So here, again, we're looking for places where the fault is offset this channel. And this is basically something called maximum similarity, which is basically additional processing that you can do to the data after you've collected to emphasize more subtle features. And with it, you can kind of see right through here is this is the trace of the shoreline fault zone. In fact, what we've managed to do is identify an eastern and a western trace of the shoreline fault zone here in San Luis Bay. So again, this is all information that's below the sea surface, below the sediment layer. You don't see it on the surface like you did that bathymetric map that we had offshore the Diablo Canyon. Next slide. So in fact, what we found in our surveys is there are a number of channels that cut across the continental shelf that also cut across the shoreline fault zone. So we're actively now looking at these channels in detail to see what they can tell us about the rates of offset for that particular fault. Next slide. One of the setbacks, if you will, or the uncertainties that we have is in the age of the sediments that are deposited in these channels. But luckily for us, sea level has not remained static over hundreds of thousands of years. And this sea level curve, which goes back to 430,000 years, shows that there are episodes of low sea level stands. This latest one, 2, was associated with the most recent glacial maximum during the ice ages. And these are the times when you would expect to have streams cutting across the continental shelf. So what it does is it starts to give us ages that we can use to bracket some of the rates that we're going to be coming up with slip rates for the Hosbury Fault. And obviously, one of the longer term areas of concentration is going to be to see if we can get better information, better constraint on those rates. Next slide. As I mentioned before, in addition to work in San Luis Bay, we also look at the Hosbury Fault itself to see, again, if we could see stream channels that came across the fault that were subsequently offset. And down here near Point Sal, Santa Maria River, which is one of the largest drainages in the central coast of California, cuts across the Hosbury, and this is an area of particular interest in evaluation. Next slide, again, shows you kind of amplitude volumes that we can construct with this data. And the next slide shows you a map view, again, horizontal time slice through the Hosbury Fault. So this is a detail here on the right-hand side of the slide. The Hosbury is located in the center of that image, and you can kind of see these patterns here. These are the stream channels that we've identified in both map view and cross-section. And our game, or our responsibility, is to match up the channel on the east side with the channel on the west side. So the next slide shows kind of interpretation, and colored bands show some of the channels that we've identified, and the red shows just the complexity of the surface trace of the Hosbury Fault in our survey area. So this is one of the things that happens, you know, when you look at things in more detail, you find out they're much more complex than you originally thought. Next slide, okay, but go back again, please. So basically, where we are right now is looking at these channels in more detail and just trying to understand the history of the offset of these so we can come up with an estimate of the slip rate for the Hosgri, both in San Luis Bay and then further north in Estero Bay. Next slide. This report is scheduled to be issued in the fourth quarter of this year, 2013, and like the last report we issued, will be distributed to the IPRP, the SHAC team, and then also posted on our website for interested readers. Next slide. The HES survey. Just briefly, this is supposed to be the complementary piece to the low energy seismic survey work that we did. Low energy was much easier to permit and conduct in high energy. The next slide shows just the history of the steps that we went through to try to seek a permit to do this work offshore. And this required coordination with both the state of California as well as a number of federal agencies because we were bracketing state and federal waters to do this. Next slide. Unfortunately, while the State Lands Commission issued us a geophysical survey permit in August of 12, the Coastal Commission decided to deny our development permit application, and as a result, that work was stopped. And on the federal side, our incidental harassment authorization was withdrawn. So here in 2013, the final decision on these high energy studies offshore is really pending the review of existing data. So this gets back to that other geophysics that I talked about earlier. Next slide.
What's the issue that, or issues that kept that from being approved, or what are the sort of concerns about doing that high energy work?
Is primarily the effects of sound in the sea on the environment. These were rather loud noises that people were afraid were going to be deleterious to marine mammals and other kinds of wildlife in the area.
Okay, thanks.
Next slide. So this is just a review of the work that we've been doing onshore. So this is complementary to the marine work. And here with this idea to develop a top-to-bottom profile, we use different sources. This is what we call accelerated weight drop, which gives us high-resolution imaging, again, to the first couple hundred meters of the crust. And then these vibra-sized trucks, which are located here, that give us deeper imaging. Again, the idea to image to the depths at which the earthquakes themselves are occurring. Next slide. In 2011, we succeeded in surveying about 120 miles of road in and around the Diablo Canyon area here in the Irish Hills. Survey routes are shown with the green lines, and these red dots that you see here was an attempt for us to install a high density of instruments to record data from these green routes to construct three-dimensional image of the crust underneath the Irish Hills, again, to help us identify faulting and that geometry. In 2012, we concentrated our activities in and around the Diablo Canyon area. Part of this was in preparation for the offshore surveys that we were expecting to do later on that year, but didn't occur. But nevertheless, we did get a lot of valuable data on land in and around Diablo Canyon. Next slide. This just shows a detail of one of those seismic lines to the north. This is near Montagna del Oro. Morro Bay is located right here. And one of the things that you want to do with seismic work is try to tie in what you see in the reflection profiles with well data. This gives you some hard evidence that you can use to interpret the seismic sections that you create. So these are the locations of some available wells that we had in the area. And the next slide shows a cross-section through that survey route with well locations and then some preliminary interpretations of that seismic data in terms of the geology and the stratigraphy. This is an activity that's currently ongoing now with our seismic interpretation team. Next slide. And we expect to have the report on that interpretation issued in the second quarter of 2014. So by this next summer, the SHAC group will have all the information on seismic source characterization for their work in developing their probabilistic seismic hazard assessment. Next slide is our ocean bottom seismometer program. So recognizing that there was a considerable degree of uncertainty in earthquake locations offshore, primarily because all your seismic stations are located onshore, and the direction of maximum uncertainty, if you will, is perpendicular to the coast. We initiated a program to install ocean bottom seismometers offshore in the area near where this intersection of the two faults occurs. So these are our pictures of a temporary unit that we're going to be putting down this summer for a couple of weeks to just get a better understanding of noise conditions in the area, and then a diagram of a more permanent facility that is going to be located offshore for about 10 years. So the idea is that by installing these offshore, and these are all going to be wired in real time to the plant located here, we'll have the necessary control to improve the earthquake locations in this critical area. Next slide. Finally, as I mentioned before, all the information that we've collected as part of this project is going to be put into a legacy data archive. So information about earthquakes, geology, geophysics, all will be available at a PG&E website, and we're also in negotiation with some other organizations to help us manage the great volume of seismic data that we're going to be generating as a result of all this work. But the goal is to make this information available so others can take a look at it. If they want to develop what we call proponent models or additional models for the shack to consider in their deliberations, everybody will be working off the same page using the same database. So this is our commitment to provide this information in a public forum. And that is my briefing. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So just very high level, I mean, this is a lot of information, a lot of effort, a lot of resources. I guess, so really one specific question. How on the high energy stuff, I guess a little more description of what that entails actually, like what you were asking for, and maybe your idea of why the Coastal Commission was uncomfortable with it, more than sort of generic impacts on males, like what are you actually proposing to do? And then a more, that isn't happening, but lots of things have happened, and this has been going on for decades. And I guess more sort of specifically, how is this report going to sort of, what are the then policy questions and potential actions going forward that this improved understanding is presumably going to enable? Is it additional earthquake retrofitting on the plant site itself? Is it contingency planning in other ways? Is it informing relicensing conditions? What sorts of things are you anticipating that this broader, deeper understanding is going to enable?
Okay.
So two questions I asked them.
Yeah, so let me answer question number 2 first, and then also defer to my colleague, Mr. Strickland, sitting next to me. The work that we're doing right now really is probably a first major improvement in our understanding of the geology and tectonics of the central California coast in more than 20 years. And that last episode was, coincident with the LTST work and a lot of exploration work that was being done in the 1980s. So we've added a new chapter in our understanding of onshore and offshore geology as a result of it. This is very expensive to conduct, and this is not typically what outside of the oil industry you really expect folks to do. So this has given us an opportunity to have a unique picture of the area that we're concerned with. The impacts of this work, as you asked, on policy decisions and engineering decisions, I think we're really going to wait until the shack finishes their deliberation in 2015, and then coordination with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So the shack group has been empowered to take all this information and analyze it, evaluate it in terms of the seismic hazard assessment. So that's the point where we'll start to see the impact in terms of the engineering safety of the plant. You want to add anything?
Sure. My name is Gerald Strickland. I'm the Director of Nuclear Projects for Diablo Canyon.
Okay.
And what we expect is that as the shack process completes the development of seismic source characterizations, then associated ground motion characterizations, that will then be used as part of the response to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Orders 5054F to be able to then create a new seismic spectra for Diablo Canyon, compare it to the existing design bases, and in turn evaluate whether or not there are additional studies that need to be performed to assess the capabilities of the plant. An example that would be that if, say, on the low frequency end of a spectra, that you determined that you had some responses outside the range of your current spectra, you go back and you look at what types of equipment, components, systems that would be sensitive to that type of motion, and in turn then evaluate as to whether or not any additional motion would have an impact on the qualification of those components.
Okay, so thanks. That helps me understand. I mean, this, you know, this set of issues is one of these. I mean, nuclear in general, you can kind of characterize like this. Sort of probabilities are relatively hard to get one's head around, and so, you know, how low probability. I imagine, you know, the seismic assessments sort of feed into, you know, what is sort of a probabilistic approach to what might happen and what the risk of that is, and then what the sort of, you know, justifiable investment in remedying any risk at what level and all that. So that probabilistic assessment, you know, reducing risk overall is really difficult to do. And so I just, it's obvious to you who are in this industry, but I think this is a particularly difficult thing for policy to grapple with. And we're talking long term, right? I mean, we're talking, so 2015, eventually some number of years to sort of digest, come up with recommendations, base it in the technology that's actually the plan, and then come up with something concrete to actually do to the plan if that's necessary. We're talking 2020. What is a time frame on that whole process to sort of play out?
Timeline right now would be that by 2017 that we'd have to better quantify as to whether or not there were any specific areas in the plan that needed additional assessment or potential modification.
Okay, and then that assessment and then potential modification.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Did you want us to do the topic?
Do you want to talk about HES?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
All right, so on the screen is, on the right-hand side, are the ship tracks that we had proposed for the HES study. So these were basically drawn to help us understand the deep geometry of a number of different fault zones in the area, including the Hosgry fault zone, shoreline fault zone, and then also additional faulting here in San Luis Bay. So the HES itself, the high energy survey, would involve firing a series of air guns with a volume of about 3,000, 4,000 cubic inches on a repetitive basis, and then recording the echoes of the returns from that on streamers. The streamers themselves on the order of 4 to 5 kilometers long, right, to get the offset or the imaging at the depths that we needed. Again, we wanted to map where the earthquakes are actually occurring. When we're doing the low energy work, our streamers were 50 meters more long because we were imaging very shallow. So the deeper you go, the larger the offset. So there are a number of challenges that brings up, not only being able to drive a boat with 4 or 5 kilometers worth of streamer behind it, so it's a navigational challenge, but also how do you maneuver inside a coastal area then to collect the kind of information that you do. In addition to these logistical challenges, and these surveys were, these track charts were drawn to minimize the operational challenge. There are a number of environmental challenges that we came to discover along the way in terms of populations of otters, whale migrations that came up and down the coast, populations of porpoises that live down here near Point Sal. All of these were considered. The original proposal that we had to do the high energy work was to coincide with the minimum in whale migration activity along the coast of California, and then through negotiation it got it will focus to the absolute minimum, the 2 or 3 week period where the lowest migration activity would happen. So between August of 2012 and November, there was a series of negotiations where these ship track lines were gradually whittled away till finally, when we appeared in front of the Coastal Commission, we were just talking about doing one set of surveys here in Estero Bay. And that was going to be set up as a pilot program to demonstrate that the mitigation activities that we had identified were going to be sufficient and adequate to protect marine wildlife, as well as demonstrate that the experiment design was adequate to image at depth in this particular area. We devoted a considerable amount of resources to developing a comprehensive mitigation program, monitoring animal activity that's going to have overflights, as well as boats in the water, setting up safety radii around the ship to try to keep animals away or getting closer to the vessel where the sound levels were a lot louder. But despite that, it was just ruled to be too environmentally dangerous to proceed forward.
Okay, well, I appreciate that in depth. I mean, I can kind of imagine why. I mean, it's going to be kind of loud and disruptive in ways that I think others have confronted those same challenges. I mean, the military and the sonar issue is in there too, and I think some similar characteristics, although different kind of process. But certainly, would not want to minimize those impacts.
Yeah,
so.
And just to add a little bit more, this is the discussion that's happening right now actually on the east coast of the United States too, in terms of exploration on the continental shelf in the eastern United States, is the impact on marine life.
So, we haven't done any public questions yet. I guess, are we...
We hadn't planned on doing that as part of the panels. We were going to save that for the public comment period. However, we are about 5 minutes ahead of time if you do want to open it up for people.
I think, anybody in the room, and I don't know how many folks we have listening in, but it'd be good to open it up for comment.
All right.
We have a couple of interested parties here. Yeah, questions, really, not comments.
Yeah, we have questions.
Yeah, so sure.
Yes.
I know, you guys, Lynette or Suzanne, you probably want to manage the flow here. If you introduce yourself, I'd be great.
Hello, my name is Ray Lutz. I'm with Citizens Oversight. In the first part of your presentation, you made the statement that nothing to worry about really with Diablo Canyon in terms of seismology concerns, and we can go forward with the way we are. Then we had a long presentation about a lot of work that was done to try to figure out what's known about these faults. And it sounds like you don't even really know. But I guess the question is, can you answer this? What is the likelihood that we'll have a devastating earthquake near Diablo Canyon such that there'll be an emergency at the plant, which will cause an evacuation? Since you said there's no concern, I hope that you've gone through the process of saying there's a certain probability. Have you gotten to that point or not?
That is the role of the SHAC process and the 5054F reports that we are currently undertaking right now.
So would you like to retract the statement that you think that it's safe because you don't really know at this point?
I don't think I said it was safe in my remarks. I said that as of today, we have not uncovered any information that indicates that we're outside of our licensing basis.
So let me add some information on that. Where Diablo Canyon has a seismic licensing design basis that we've been designed for and continue to be analyzed for. That seismic design basis has been reviewed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and Diablo Canyon has been determined to be safely configured, continues to be safely operated.
Apparently, because you don't know any very much now.
Not argumentative, please, just questions.
Please, we were looking just for questions, not for commentary or argumentative statements.
Okay, second question is, on the Wikipedia site for San Onofre, it states that there is 4,000 plus tons of waste on site, and yet other sources say there's 1,400 tons. You have a certain number of assemblies identified in your slide. How many tons of waste exist at the San Onofre plant site?
I don't have the exact number. Obviously, we know how many fuel assemblies we have. We know what the loading of that in terms of spent fuel, and so there is a number. I don't know how it compares to Wikipedia, and we can provide that information.
Okay, that's the question. Maybe if there's a weight per assembly, we can calculate and figure it out. Since there's a conflict in the Wikipedias, and some people are quoting that, so I want to make sure we get it accurate. Thank you.
Thanks for your questions. Next time.
Yeah, just to maybe just to add on, we have provided that information in one of our data requests to the CEC.
Great, and those are public.
Thank you, Commissioner McAllister. I'm Bruce Gibson. I'm the 2nd District Supervisor for the County of San Luis Obispo and the county's representative to the IPRP.
Hey, great. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. I sit on the IPRP both as an elected official, but also holding a doctorate in geophysics with a 15-year research career in high-energy seismic reflection surveys. If you would indulge me just a brief amount of technical commentary, I would offer you the chance. I'd be happy to chat with you later about some of the technical issues in the high-energy survey proposal. In the IPRP, and particularly between Dr. Mrnyshenko and myself, we had a robust conversation. And it was my conclusion that the technical details of the proposal were not up to the state of the art. And that means both in terms of their environmental impacts and the quality of the image that might be gained. This has been hashed out in a long series of things. So I won't go into that at this point. But I would like to also offer commissioners a question that you might, or a thought that you might consider, and that is, at the nature of the policy question here is an assessment of the risk to this very important facility. It is being conducted under probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. And Dr. Mrnyshenko and others have gone through the stages there. Basically, we try to find out what's the biggest earthquake that might occur within the region. It has to do with the length of faults, the depth of faults, which way they trend, and how fast they move. Out of that, we find that the bigger a fault area that we can find, the larger is the potential earthquake. But in a completely counterintuitive way, if we find a larger magnitude earthquake is possible, the probability of it occurring is less. And so the overall hazard to the facility goes down. And as a public elected official, I've tried to explain that to folks as recently as this morning over coffee, and it is completely at odds with common sense in a lot of ways. And I think it's actually something that this state, certainly my county, wants to discuss further with the NRC. And I'd be interested in Commissioner Weissenmiller's insights into interactions with the NRC as to whether we have the right policy framework, the right methodology that we're talking about as a policy framework for deciding on risk to this important facility.
Great. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. Certainly, anything you want to submit in writing, we appreciate it.
All right, in the interest of time, I do want to take one question from the online folks, and then I think we'll need to move on to stay on our schedule. The question is from Tam Hunt from the Clean Coalition. It's for Mr. Nelson. He says, does SCE currently have a cost estimate for decommissioning?
There's actually a cost estimate that's being done right now as well, an update, but the current estimate is approximately $4 billion for the entire decommissioning process. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.
Let's
And with
move
that, I
on
think
next
it's the end of this panel. We're due to take a 10-minute break before we start our second panel. So parties can be back here at 11:35. Thank you very much. Barbara, we really need to stay on schedule. We can catch you on the next round.